So I just want to welcome everybody. I'm Vincent Savolainen. I'm Deputy Head of Life Sciences at Imperial College. And today really is a celebration of the appointment of Colin Prentice as Chair of Biosphere and Climate Impacts. And he's going to give us a talk. But we are obviously, before he gives his talk, we are very thankful to AXA, who is sponsoring the chair. And Jean Drouf, who is Director of Risk and Strategy, is going to say a few words about their vision and why they sponsored the chair. So.
Can you hear me? Yes. I'm Jean Drouf, so I'm in charge of finance, risk and strategy for AXA in the UK, and I'm very honored to be with you tonight. So I just want to do a quick introduction to try to explain AXA's commitment to research and to explain the why of this philanthropic action that we are making. So AXA is the first insurer worldwide, operating in 60 countries with over 100 million clients. And insurance is all about transferring risk. It's all about helping people when they need it, hence when they've had just an event. We've done insurance as being something that was quite reactive traditionally. So you had a car accident, we're here to help you put back on the road. You have a burglary, we're here to help you financially cover your losses. You have healthcare issues, we're here to help you through the medical treatment, etc. More recently, we are focused more on the prevention. And we are as well helping our clients understanding more the risks. So this is why we are committing to the AXA Research Fund. The risks have changed, and it's not anymore looking at the past in order to predict the future. Now we have to have some consensus, some consensual views about the evolution of the risk. So just talking a bit about the AXA Research Fund. So it was created in 2007. We've committed 100 million euros in the last 6 years to the AXA Research Fund. I was in Paris last week with Professor Prentice, where our chairman and CEO announced that we'll be continuing on this effort, and he has announced that we are making another pledge of another 100 million for the next 6 years. It's very important for us because we really want to make sure that we are not basing the appraisal of risk on historical views, but more on consensual, well-informed views about what the risk could be. So the AXA Research Fund is an ambitious international and philanthropic scientific initiative. In the last 6 years, we have sponsored more than 300 researchers. As I mentioned, we've pledged 100 million euros to these researchers. I'm very glad as well to say that the UK has done extremely well. Out of the 100 million euros, the UK was the second country with 14 million euros, which I think is a great testimony of the quality of the research in this country. So, having talked generally about the research fund, I just want to say a few words about Professor Prentice and his work. So, I had the privilege of meeting Professor Prentice last week, and we talked a bit about the subject. So, you'll see by yourself, Colin is very passionate about what he's doing, and it was very good for me to understand that actually there are quite a lot of models, even if there is no consensus, but there are quite a lot of models about climate change and what will happen. But there is actually very little focus on the consequences from a biosphere of the climate change. So this is why we are so proud of being able to finance Professor Prentice researches on this particular area. So I will be, as part of my role, I will be the AXA sponsor for this chair. meaning that I will be liaising with Professor Prentice and his team, but as well more generally with Imperial College. It's a great honor for me to support this institution. It's actually, this is not the first time we are supporting the Imperial College as part of the research fund. In the last 6 years, we have been supporting 6 projects. So I think that's a continuation, and I think that's once again a testimony of the quality of the research in this very international institution. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Prentice.
Well, some of you might recognise the title, an allusion to a sensationalist novel by a famous writer in which he rubbishes climate change and makes fun of environmentalists. It's quite entertaining, but it has a particularly annoying appendix, but in which he does some sort of data analysis and stuff, but it's kind of a bit biased. Shall we say? But there was one point that intrigues me. If we look at this, this is the actual from the last IPCC Working Group 1 report, data on the trend in average temperature between 1901 and 2005. Now, in his book, Michael Crichton analyses data, real data from weather stations in the southeastern United States, and points out that they're cooling and not warming. So anyway, here's the data. It's perfectly true. Southeastern United States is cooling. Nearly everywhere else is warming. So I think there are people here, maybe in the front row, who know exactly why this is. Not my quite my specialism, changes in the atmospheric circulation. This is a bit of a digression, by the way, but I thought I'd start with a digression, just to warm you up a bit. This is, of course, a famous diagram from the IPCC. I like this because it makes a good point about what climate models can't do. The observations on both panels are the same. The observations are in black. And there are 2 versions of climate model runs. Below is with all of the forcings except greenhouse gases, and at the top it's all of the forcings, including greenhouse gases. So one thing climate models can't do, of course, is predict the actual variation yet, anyway, from year to year, predict when the actual ups and downs occurs, except when they're forced, for example, by volcanoes, which have quite a dramatic effect. And of course, another thing climate models can't do is reproduce this trend without the effects of greenhouse gases, because, well, you know, if you didn't have greenhouse gases, you would need some magic or mystical mechanism in order to produce these trends. So anyway, this is the background, this is what's going on, and why do we care about it? The global mean temperature is an abstraction. Nobody experiences the global mean temperature. And you might think, well, it just changed by a few degrees. What's that? You know, it changes a few degrees every day, doesn't it? So you might think it's not important. Well, turns out that's not right, because the long-term average matters. But there are different categories of impacts that we talk about and reasons why we care. Some of these I call direct impacts of temperature change, and that would include things like the effects of heat waves on people, which can be, under certain circumstances, quite severe. But I suggest that these are sort of in a minority and possibly are among the easier to adapt to. So a lot of the problems with heat waves, for example, the Paris heat wave in 2003, which actually killed quite a lot of people, but analysis shows that part of the problem is that Paris, of course, was not adapted to have the climate of a much hotter city, you know, of Tucson or something. So these are things to which I think we know how to adapt to. A much more intractable class of impacts, which causing seemingly increasingly expensive damage through flooding because of increased precipitation and storm strength in some regions, droughts in some regions, certainly not all, but in some already drought-prone regions, hurricanes, where the evidence seems to be that hurricanes may be increasing in strength, if not in frequency, and of course sea level rise, which has the potential to be very costly to adapt to. So I'm not going to talk about those impacts, although they are very important, because I'm a biologist, and there is a third category of impacts, which are impacts on processes in the biosphere. In other words, processes affecting living organisms. And ecosystems. And my focus is very much on the land, because that's what I study, so I won't say very much at all about marine systems, but I will say something about natural ecosystems and species, managed ecosystems, so impacts on grazing systems, forestry, and impacts on crops. And obviously these are things that indirectly affect us potentially a great deal. And although there are a lot of papers about this subject, in some way that body of knowledge is still not really coherent, as I'll come to. And so this is the area that I'm planning to make the main focus of my research in the next few years. Yeah, this one, right. So there are two sides to climate change that are of interest to policymakers, which we use in a rather specialized way. We use these terms adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation meaning taking steps to protect ourselves so as to avoid an impact. So you don't see an impact if you've adapted to it. And the other is called mitigation. And mitigation means anything that avoids net CO2 emissions and is thus aimed at stabilizing the climate. Of course, these are very different types of actions. Adaptation is primarily local or national. Mitigation, as we know, for it to be effective, it has to be done in some sort of a coordinated way across the world. Now, just a word about the reports of the IPCC. This is not the Independent Police Complaints Commission. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is, as it says, it's a panel that actually, is owned and operated by governments, but engages a great deal of time of the people who are involved in climate science. And the fifth assessment report is due. The first came out in 1990. The fifth is due to be completed in 2014. And there are three working groups for IPCC. Working group 1 is called the Physical Science Basis. The second is called Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, which is where a lot of what I'm talking about belongs. 3 is about mitigation. Now, I argue in some ways Working Group 2 has the hardest task, and there are several reasons for that. One is that the literature about impacts is very much regional. Of course, the impacts themselves are regional. They happen in a regional context, and so there are papers about this region and that region, and then you find there are large regions where there aren't any papers. And then in these papers, you tend to find that models and scenarios are used very inconsistently, so there's no sort of unifying methodology, very hard to compare one study with another, and I'd argue even an incoherent theoretical basis. So people are starting from different assumptions in the paper. So it's a horrible task. I would hate to be Chris Field, who is the current chair of the IPCC Working Group 2. Terrible job. Every time, Working Group 2 produces a much thicker book, and I think this is because they've got to expend lots and lots of words trying to explain what on earth is going on. So anyway, they do the best job they can, but I think it's tough. Now, I spent many years studying what's called the global carbon cycle, and the global carbon cycle is all about the fact that there is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but there is also more carbon on land, in ecosystems, in the soils underneath them, and vastly more in the ocean. And the point is that there is cycling, very fast cycling between these. And we didn't really know about this thing at all. Nobody talked about the global carbon cycle until it dawned on people that the atmospheric CO2 was increasing. It was predicted to do so already by a Swedish chemist, Svante Arrhenius, in the late 19th century, but it wasn't actually able to be measured until the 1950s, and it became very rapidly clear that indeed it was rising, and so people started to think about how that can happen. Many people believed that CO2 was immutable, that the concentration of CO2 would not change over geological time. Now we know this is very, very wrong. Now, since the late 1980s, there have been developed computational models for the uptake and release of carbon dioxide by ecosystems, and since the late 1990s, these have even been coupled into climate models so we can look at the feedbacks. But there is a little problem, which is that there are a number of different models, and they seem to give very different results for two kinds of feedbacks. Now, look up the top here, I mentioned that the global carbon cycle is a topic that's covered by Working Group 1, the physical science basis, although many of the key processes, of course, are biological, not strictly physical, and they include analyses of these two types of feedback. So one is the feedback resulting from the CO2 effect on plant growth. By that, I mean CO2 is the building block of carbon. that's fixed by the plants, so it's the sort of the basis of life. So CO2 is incorporated into plants, and if you increase the amount of CO2 up to a point, which apparently is a higher point than we're at now, it has a positive, it has an increasing effect on plant growth. So that's what's technically known as a negative feedback. Negative not in the sense that it's bad, negative in the sense that it's a process that dampens the initial CO2 rise. So if you put CO2 in the atmosphere, part of it is taken up as a result of this process. Part of it is taken up as additional plant growth. The other type of feedback is the carbon climate feedback, by which, if it gets warmer, as it gets warmer, the rate of decomposition of soil carbon, soil organic carbon, increases. So that's a microbial process. That puts a bit of extra CO2 back in the atmosphere. So that's technically called a positive feedback, not in the sense that it's good, rather the reverse. It's a problem that it's a process that actually amplifies the process. So, well, it's a bit depressing that the models give such different results, and yet, if we look at the situation, and I've been in this business long enough, I can do this, comparing to the situation 25 years ago, we seem to be actually in a rather fantastically good position to do science. We have got unprecedented data resources. We have data streams recording many different aspects of the land surface, so its sort of vegetation cover and its moisture and so on, from various Earth observation satellites. They're getting better and better. We have high precision, very high precision atmospheric measurements of CO2 itself and many other species that help us to understand the carbon cycle. And we also have compilations of data that is collected, here, there, and everywhere, but by scientists, but in the end can amount to thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of data points about plants, about ecosystems, and about paleo records, which I'll come back to in a bit. We also have, of course, fantastic computational power. We have some rather advanced modeling tools that can do things that we hardly imagined 10 or 20 years ago. And there have been major advances in understanding how ecosystems work. Now, carbon uptake and water loss, of course, two very fundamental processes in the biosphere. The CO2 goes into plant leaves, and it goes in through little tiny pores called stomata, which are very tightly regulated by the plant, so they can be more open or they can be more closed. But whatever they are, they take in CO2 and they lose water. If they're very open, they can take in a lot of CO2, but they're going to lose a lot of water. So there's a trade-off, plants by plants, and it seems that this trade-off is regulated in some sort of optimal way. We still don't understand physically quite how they work, but it appears to be optimized for the balance between CO2 uptake and water loss. And this allows us to make some very simple, effective models of how the system works. So in a way, this sort of microscopic process, which plants do, is one of the most fundamental processes in the biosphere. And remember that of all the evaporation, the water that comes out of leaves and then sort of reforms into precipitation on land, over 90% of that actually goes through plants. Another thing we've learned about is the role of biodiversity in buffering environmental variability. In other words, good reasons why an ecosystem that consists of, let's say, 10, 20 species, major species, is more effective than one that consists of only one species. Well, I argue that we could be making a lot better use of some of these developments. I think there are fantastic opportunities for research that is integrative and collaborative, leading to what I'm calling next generation models, for want of a better term. It does require, I think, that to really use this knowledge, it requires that we think outside of our boxes. People talk about the difficulties of communication between disciplines, but actually there are possibly even worse difficulties in communicating between sort of very narrow subdisciplines. There are people who study ecology and plant physiology and biogeography, paleoecology, do remote sensing of Earth satellites. They're basically all different communities. And they don't really talk to one another properly. And sometimes one believes one thing and one believes another thing. And it can get very unsatisfactory. But, of course, this lack of communication, it's an opportunity. We can break down these barriers. It's a great opportunity. So what I'm giving is a personal perspective on three areas, all pretty well contested. Some of the nitty-gritties of the global carbon cycle. I'll touch briefly on the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and then end with some thoughts about how scientists could, and I think should, do things a bit differently. So we're going to go on a brief romp through the global carbon cycle. So I'm going to give you about 4 or 5 lectures worth in about 10 minutes. I'll start with this diagram. Now, this is getting quite old now. This is about 10 years old. It's slightly updated from my chapter in the 2001 IPCC report. But the reason I like this is the only diagram that I've seen anyway that tells you about, it's all data. It tells you about carbon dioxide concentrations, how they varied on various different timescales. Now, if we start at the top left, is there a pointer anywhere? Is this a pointer? Yeah, there we are. Yes. If we start at the top left, so there's the sort of timescale of direct atmospheric measurements. So starting in the late 1950s, two sites, Mauna Loa in Hawaii, high elevation, to get away from complications of cars and industry and vegetation and stuff like that messes up your CO2 record. And one at the South Pole, which is suitably far from anywhere else. The South Pole one is kind of the flat one. Mauna Loa is kind of recording variations in CO2 uptake over the biosphere in the northern hemisphere, and so that's why it has a seasonal cycle. Just more recently, the guy who figured out the technology to do this was Charles Keeling. Later on, these things run in families. His son, Ralph Keeling, figured out how to measure atmospheric oxygen, which is actually a much bigger challenge because there's a heck of a lot of it. Oxygen is indeed going down, just as CO2 is going up, which is, of course, consistent with the CO2 rise being caused by combustion process. Now, okay, that's what we see. It looks pretty simple. But you can also measure CO2 with high precision in ice cores, which give a faithful, the air bubbles in ice cores give a faithful record of CO2 concentration in the past. And so here, relatively high resolution gives, we're looking back here from 800 AD up to here 2000, see, 10 years old. Not that much variation around 280 up until about the Industrial Revolution, and then it starts to go up, and then at the end, this red is the direct measurements. Here, we're taking a longer time scale, also from ice cores, going from the last glacial maximum, a bit before 20,000 years ago, up to the present. You see there have been natural variations. At the last glacial maximum, CO2 was just over 180 parts per million. Now it's up at 280 by the time of, by pre-industrial time. So that's not including this end bit here. Here you just see the ice age cycles. This has now been extended back through even more ice age. It's the same story, just bouncing up and down between these levels during the cold periods and the warm periods. Going back 20 million years, we finally start seeing some substantially higher concentrations. And if you go back a long way in the geological record, these are indirect reconstructions because there's no ice cores on this time scale, of course. Wasn't even any ice before about somewhere here. You see that in a long geological perspective, the CO2 concentration that we're dealing with over the last 20 million years or so is actually quite low. There have been extremely high values at various times in the past. Now, we have a reasonably good understanding of what causes these changes, and I'm not going to go into much detail here, but just to mention that on different timescales, different processes come into operation. So here, if you start with rock, which we will put in its simplest form as calcium silicate, takes up CO2 in the process of weathering. These species end up in the sea. Some of them, they get sedimented with the release of one CO2, and then the second CO2 doesn't come out until there has been uplift of the land, and eventually it comes out in volcanoes. So this is a very large-scale, long-term process, but has been responsible for extremely large variations in CO2 concentration in the distant past. This looks like just chemistry and geology. Actually, even this has got quite a lot of biology in it, because the weathering is greatly enhanced by plants. And secondly, because the sedimentation is the work of calcifying organisms in the ocean. We don't fully understand the variations between glacial and interglacial times in CO2, but this is just a sort of a hypothesis. I think a hypothesis for which there is solid evidence for each one of these arrows, and I won't I won't say exactly what's going on here, but just pointing out that there are sort of positive feedbacks, there are self-reinforcing feedbacks in this system that may be involved in keeping the CO2 low during ice ages and keeping it warm in warm periods with relatively rapid transitions in between. Let's look now what the processes that are going on. Now, atmospheric CO2 is, of course, used by plants in a process called photosynthesis. That's what green plants do, and that's the biggest area of all. Some of it goes straight back in respiration, about half of it. The other half ends up as soil organic carbon through decay and microbial action, and then some more microbial action turns that carbon back into atmospheric CO2. And this is an enormous amount of CO2. 1/6 of the entire, the whole atmosphere, the CO2 in the whole atmosphere, 1/6 of the atmosphere goes through plants every year. So it's very big. I showed you CO2 and oxygen. This is an updated version. CO2 rising here, oxygen falling there. As you see, this is really precise data, and we can use that data to figure out what happens to the CO2 that we put in the atmosphere. So I'll explain that more in a minute, but we'll need some basic data first. The basic currency of the carbon cycle is the petagram. 1 petagram, which is also sometimes called 1 gigaton, and whatever you call it, it's 1 billion tons of carbon. Not CO2. Some discussions use CO2. But in the carbon cycle literature, mainly it's 1 billion. we talk about petagrams of carbon, so 1 billion tons of carbon. 1 part per million in the atmosphere is about 2 petagrams. I've said this already, it was about 280. It's now reached 400, rising about 2 parts per million per year on average. We know where this comes from. It comes from fossil fuel. It has its isotopic signature. It's old carbon, because it's got no radiocarbon, no C14 in it, which is radioactive. None of that whatsoever. And it's biospheric carbon, because we know that from its C13 signature, for those of you who like isotopes. Now, interestingly, it doesn't all stay in the air. We know how much we emit globally, good statistics on that. The so-called airborne fraction, which is the fraction that stays in the atmosphere, is only about half of that. And there's an uptake by the ocean, and there's an uptake by the land. But the uptake by the ocean has no effect on atmospheric oxygen because it's just dissolving. The uptake by the land, however, releases CO2. So using that information, we can actually make a budget. So to cut a long story short and to spare you the equations, here are budgets for the 1990s of the 2000s. So you see the rate of increase. This is the rate of increase in petagrams per year in the atmosphere, 3, 4. But the fossil fuel burning increase of 6.4 to 7.7. There's not all staying in the atmosphere. Some of it's being taken up elsewhere. The negative sign here means going down. So going down from the atmosphere. There's about 2 petagrams per year going into the atmosphere. And from the O2, the oxygen statistics, and some other methods too, we can infer what is actually the sum of these two numbers, the net uptake by the land. So there is a net uptake, and we can partition this further between the land use change component, which is, of course, adding to the emissions through deforestation, and an uptake component. So the land is actively taking up carbon. So ecosystems are actively taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's a lot of things we understood. So obviously we could do all this. We can make a computational model. We can apply it with all the processes. We can change CO2 and climate and then see what's happened. So, and of course, models developed by different groups obviously would give the same answer. Well, we don't. A little complicated diagram here. This is the impact on airborne fraction. So remember, airborne fraction is the part that stays in the air. And this is just a range of model results. So let's look at this one, the effects of CO2 on net primary production. That's the part of the CO2 uptake that actually goes into plants as opposed to being sent back to the atmosphere. So, it might be small or it might be large. Effect of climate change. So this is the effect of warming on net primary production. Might be positive, might be negative. So this is what we call uncertainty. And I prefer to call it ignorance, because differences among the models. I think this is not good. In fact, I've described this as being scandalous. I think, but the trouble is that it turns out that there are some persistent disagreements about how these processes work. And so I'm posing the question, are we really working towards a common understanding? Are we trying to get rid of this so-called uncertainty? Are we developing a kind of a standard model based on what we know? I think the answer rather is no. And meanwhile, high-profile papers are published that basically are nonsense. So here we had a newspaper, this was very much publicised in newspapers, the story of declining net primary production. So the net primary production is in green. This is derived from satellite data from 2000 to 2009. Now, first of all, if that's a trend, then I'm a Dutchman. Secondly, well, here is the atmospheric CO2. They've inverted this just to show the resemblance. So it's quite true that in these years that are shown to have low net primary production, you have a greater rate of increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. But the problem is that this then attributes, because the scales here are the same on the left and the right. So the scales are the same. So this says it's all due to variations in MPP, which it's not, because there's a big effect also on respiration, microbial, soil decomposition as well. So lots of problems here. The global trend is not significant. The MPP is it's not a measurement at all. I mean, it's from satellites, but the satellites fed into a model, and not a very good one at that. The MPP response to temperature is certainly too strong. It's a model artifact. And another thing, this model doesn't even have any effects of CO2 on plant growth. So some of these things were dealt with in subsequent correspondence in the journal. But they got 6 technical reports submitted, of which only 2 were published. I'll say no more about that. I'll get on to this one. Now, there's some real results here, some results that I think are believable. This is a summary of results from many experiments which have been done with free air carbon dioxide enrichment. It's a technology that enables you to put extra CO2 where you want it for a long time to see what happens to the productivity. It's quite advanced technology. It turns out to be actually very difficult to get CO2 just where you want it. Now, you want it just fertilizing a piece of forest. You don't want it going all over the shop. You want it to just constantly fertilize that piece of forest. And of course, it has to be good CO2. It has to be not CO2 that's contaminated with ethylene or anything else that might be poisonous to the plant. So it has to be, drinks grade CO2, the same that goes into Coca-Cola. So anyway, that's actually the most expensive part of doing the experiments, is putting the CO2 where you want it. Anyway, a lot of these studies have now been done in forests of both high productivity and low productivity. So here is the net primary production. And what you see here is the net primary production after CO2 has been increased by 200 ppm, parts per million, for a number of years. And what you see is there's a little bit of a slope on this as compared to the one-to-one line. It works out about 23% enhancement of net primary production very consistently. Now, there are papers that have sort of, tried to claim that this effect might go away, etc. But I mean, these data are still strong. They're still valid. And so this is important information. I won't bother to explain the bottom half there. A story has sort of been around for a long time that this CO2 effect should be dependent on having a high supply of nitrogen. Now, that sort of makes sense. All plants, of course, they're not just made of carbon. They have to have nitrogen to make proteins and chlorophyll and so on. And so it's been speculated that the CO2 effect should be dependent on high nitrogen supply. Now, this is data that was shown in another paper that was reviewing these free air carbon dioxide enrichment experiments and a number of studies in which they'd also done nitrogen fertilization. So you've got a low N and a high N. And if you read the original paper, it would appear that the enhancement was very much dependent on the nitrogen supply. And if you replot them properly, so you don't plot them in the misleading way they were shown in the original paper, but you do it properly instead, so this was done by Thomas Hickler, then you find that there is no such consistent trend. So there's something here that we don't quite understand. We don't quite understand what's going on. Now, we could ask, are models improving? Well, unfortunately, I can't show you any results from the current IPCC report, first because I'm not supposed to, and secondly because I haven't got them. But the actual climate model and a couple of climate carbon model results are available, and I have seen presentations where they've been analysed, and I can assure you that the rate of feedbacks have even increased. So that's not very happy. There's been a lot of effort in the community recently on systematic model benchmarking. In other words, using some of these wonderful observational data sets just to see how well each model is doing. But that hasn't sort of made it into the current published results, and so the answer there is not yet. One thing that we can be very confident about, the models are getting more and more complex, and they include more and more processes. And I argue that the more processes they include, the less we understand what's going on. So my answer to that is that improvement? I think not. One of the main improvements has been something called including the nitrogen cycle, which sounds like a good idea because it's very important. One thing that does achieve is something that's seen in experiments, which is a stronger effect of warming, stronger positive effects of warming in cold climates. But the other thing these models have aimed to do, and have succeeded in doing, is ensuring that the CO2 effect on MPP is reduced due to low nitrogen availability. And as I've shown, and I can show you many other examples, we don't even know whether that's true. So I'm a bit worried about this. Can they improve? Yes, they can, but I think we need to use observations more systematically in the building and constraining evaluating of models. And just some sort of good news stories here, I suppose, from a recently published paper. These are seasonal cycles of CO2 measured with very high precision at different stations. Up here in the northern, this is in the far north, this is in sort of northern subtropics, tropics, southern hemisphere. Very interesting stories in here about how CO2 varies naturally at different latitudes, because of course it's not immediately mixed in the atmosphere, so it's worthwhile to record it at different places. And you've got a few parts per million, even kind of 15 parts per million amplitude up here in the north. It's been called the breathing of the biosphere, and that's really what it is. In the summer, in the north, the ecosystems are taking in CO2. In the winter, they're giving it out again because decomposition then happens more rapidly than photosynthesis. And it can be used as a test for models. And there's a couple of complex models here, and there's also something called a simple model, which I won't go into, except just to notice that the simple model gets it pretty much right every time, whereas the complex model, well, they all agree up here, but down to the tropics and southern hemisphere, the complex models start to fall on their face. One thing we can do a bit better with models, variability of the annual rate of growth of CO2, rate of increase. You see things like the big El Nino events here and here. So the El Nino events, the tropics are warm, ecosystems give out CO2, so there's a big spike in the rate of increase of CO2. Here was the eruption of Mount Pinatubo when the globe was cooled by about half a degree, and you see that the ecosystems were taking up much more CO2 than usual. So there's a lot of variability there, which we actually can reproduce in models. And then this can be used, for example, to pin down the carbon climate feedback. And this is from some recent work by Peter Cox, who's here somewhere, which is basically pointing out that even though models differ a whole lot in this sort of climate impact of, or the impact of climate on CO2, there is a very good correlation between this thing, which we can't measure, and this thing, which is the empirical sensitivity of the CO2 growth rate, as I showed in the last slide. So we can measure this. We know how responsive the tropical ecosystems actually are to CO2 from measurements in the atmosphere. So knowing that, which gives us this range here, we can say these models are in the right range, the others are not. So that's an elegant use of some observations that are out there, that have been out there for a while. And as a final example, biome distributions in the pre-industrial time and in the Ice Age. So we can do a pretty good job at simulating. So this is just based on climate. There's no actual information on vegetation here, just about climate. But, you recognize here's the rainforest, here's the deserts, here's the deciduous forests, and so on. So we can do that. We can also run climate models for last glacier maximum. This is the sort of consensus areas where 3 out of 4 models gave the same results. You see some big changes, reductions of the forest areas, especially in temperate zones, but also in the tropics. Large areas that are now forests were then tundra. And this is data from work of many people, pollen analysts over a long time, which are reconstructions of vegetation type at the last glacial maximum. You can compare this with this. You see these big reductions of forest area and so on. So you get some things right. We also know that the carbon stored on land has increased since the last glacial maximum. We know that from isotopic analysis. We can show that you need a CO2 effect on plant growth in order to explain that. And you can explain it quantitatively, otherwise you can't. And it's not just the rate of growth and the biomass storage, it's also the prevalence of forests. This itself also requires the effects of CO2 on plant growth. So it's real. Now, I'm going to go much more briefly into this, but this is following up the theme of the very interesting and sometimes quite challenging things that can be learned from the record of climate and vegetation changes in the past. Large and rapid climate change, which we are expected to have, it's expected at its beginning, we're expected to have during this century. Large and rapid climate change is not new. During the last ice age, there were about 20 of these events, which for brevity we'll call DO events. Causes totally different to what's going on today, but it's interesting to examine them because the rates and magnitudes are quite remarkable. Each of these had a profile with a rapid warming, which depending on where you were in the world, it could be up to 10 degrees in a century, followed by usually much slower cooling. And the last of these warmings basically became the ice age termination. So the system was given a shove over into a warm state. The North Atlantic region, meaning Europe and most of North America, warmed by something like 5 to 10 degrees in a few decades. So that's a really big change. And the global impact is shown by this rather complicated diagram here. At the top you see temperature records from Greenland. This follows the geological convention. So geologists like to have time going from the right-hand side to the left. I don't know why, but that's what they do. Just focus on the left column. What's been done here is all 20 events have been shoved together and basically centered on the big warming. So there you see the massive warming in Greenland, followed by slow cooling. And then you see the changes in atmospheric methane concentration, CO2, nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas, dust going way down, fire going way up. So these were global in their impacts. And during the last of those events, when we finally had the termination of the ice age, among thousands of plant species which are known as pollen and fossils from the last ice age, we only know of one species that went extinct. We do know that plants, insects and small mammals at least migrated very long distances. Large mammals had a much tougher time. Many large mammals became extinct. And I think, although there is a school of thought that says that that was due to overhunting, I think everybody now accepts that that was only a part of the story, that climate change was certainly involved. I might just mention, this doesn't seem to be published yet, but there has been produced by Alan Cooper in Adelaide ancient DNA evidence that large mammals also went extinct precisely during this year warming event. So there are different things going on in different groups. Niche models are models that predict the distribution of species based on climate, and there have been some very, very alarming predictions produced by niche models which seem to indicate very high rates of extinction given the kind of climate change that is projected for this century. From the paleo records, and this is just from our paper on this subject, we have examples of where different things have happened. Species have just stayed right where they are. Sometimes they've stayed close to where they are but just changed habitats. In some cases they've migrated long distances, in a few cases they've gone extinct. So we have examples here from conifer trees, and then here from deer of various kinds. So this one is well and truly extinct, the giant Irish elk. This of course is not the extinct spruce, but it's a close relative that damn nearly went extinct. So there are lots of challenges for conservation here, which I've listed. Climate change is going on top of other pressures. This implies large changes in species habitats and ranges, different responses for different groups. We don't know much about this, whether species really can adapt to migrate in the human-modified landscape? When is it time to physically move a species to somewhere where we think it might be happier? What about polar and high mountain species? And an idea that is sort of hot topic now, which is, can we actually use the natural mechanisms of biodiversity to strengthen the resilience to climate change? Okay, my last points are about the communication of impacts. And because a lot of the information is not really quantitative and not very consistent, as I said, the only way in which it can be assessed sort of in the round is essentially recourse to expert opinion, which has been called the last refuge of the scoundrel, because, you know, when people started asking me on my opinions about things, at first I was flattered, you know, and they thought, well, just a minute, I mean, why the hell should I give an opinion? You know, what I'm good at is actual science. So after a while, I stopped giving my opinion because I honestly don't think it counts for much. But, you know, what else is there if you don't really know? So anyway, this left panel was one that was actually published in the Working Group 2 report, which summarised various kinds of risks. And I won't, you know, read them all out. There's sort of different kinds of risks, some of them biological, some of them physical. But up here, you've got the global warming from 0 up to 5. And what you've got here is a colour scale. So obviously, red means bad. So red is obviously worse than yellow. Yellow is worse than right. But the trouble is, because there's no numbers on this, right? So this is just expert opinion. It's got no scale. But this was a paper that really got my goat. Published in 2009. It was an update. So this one is an update of this. But it says almost exactly the same words on it. And all that's happened is the red colours have come down a bit. You know, but there's still no scale on it. So I think, honestly, it's not very scientific. So, okay, what should we do different? I think there are better ways to do modelling, and one or two people in the room are sort of in on the conspiracy here. We think a model should not be just a construct that's developed by a particular group over many years, which is how it is at the moment. It really should embody a theory of how the system works. It should be primarily, it should help us to understand things that are actually observed. And then, you know, if we have good success with that, then we can go on to use it for assessment of futures. And next generation models will actually be simpler, as well as more realistic than today's. And I'm afraid you'll have to take my word for it, or not, as the case may be. I can't prove it yet, but I will. And finally, not only data, there's a big movement, of course, to open access publication. There's also a big groundswell behind data sharing, public data sharing. We need to do the same for models. It's very difficult to do with present models because they're so difficult to run and so complex and so on. But in future, that'll be better. And I think we need a better approach to communication. I think the state of science should be presented accurately and not simplistically. Now, there are differing views about this. They were highlighted in an editorial in Nature a few weeks ago in quite a different context, but pointing out that it was about some report in a medical context where, you know, where some of the scientists involved were saying, oh, we can't say that, don't tell the public that, you know, because we're trying to get a particular message across. And I'm glad to say the editor of Nature firmly agrees with me on this point. He says this isn't going to work, right? We can't fool the public, you know. So we shouldn't present it simplistically. We shouldn't sort of, you know, apply or accept or bow to pressure to be on message. Science is a pretty complicated business. Communicating is challenging. And then finally, we do need to distinguish knowledge from the opinion, or even worse, prejudices and so on of experts. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Might it be possible to ask when you think these better biodiversity models might be available to make policy judgments on?
Biodiversity models? No, I don't know. This is going to take a while because, you know, because it's not just a matter of making a model. It's, you know, it's a matter of understanding what's going on from the observations, and then we can, you know, when we understand that, then we can make a better model. But no.
The reason I asked the question was, you said, what do we base our decision-making processes on? So what's the best knowledge to make strategic decisions, target levels of CO2, mitigation actions, commitments, etc. we always seem to be waiting for the greater confidence to come into play, which is quite understandable, and have a kind of effective view on what we need to do. So these are very practical issues, of course. So where we stand at the moment, it'd be nice to think we have sufficient confidence to make the actual policy decisions which will keep us on the right side of a viable future.
Yes, so I mean, obviously it depends, which aspects you're most concerned about, and if the aspects are the really sort of, the big ticket issues about sea level and so on, then I think, we have a reasonable handle on. It's the biosphere ones that becomes more difficult, and then biodiversity in particular. I think we could do more in terms of, sort of a dispassionate assessment of the information we have, if we look at it in the round, and that's what I'm trying to do, In other words, don't base everything on the model when you haven't considered what the evidence says. So I think that, within, okay, all right, I'll answer that part. Within the next 3 or 4 years, I think, I hope that, that there will be an assessment that is not, it's not necessarily the sort of, the very sort of, can't think of the agency it is, but the big, thick book that the IPCC produces. I think we have to be a bit sort of independent of that process, But I think, I think we could come up with some sort of statement of what we know and what we don't know that is a lot more understandable than what you find from anywhere in the literature at the moment.
So I was interested. Given the Earth is obviously quite a complex place, and the science describing it is complicated, how is it that you think that simple models will be superior to more complicated models in describing or making predictions?
I think the complexity of the current generation of models, I think, is mostly bogus. So to give a concrete example, in almost every model that you'll find, in the current, that's treated in the current IPCC assessment, you'll find that the plants and vegetation of the world are divided up into between 5 and 15 categories, which are called plant functional types. And for each of those functional types, you have a list of numbers, which sort of describes their behaviour. And yet, those numbers are not really very well founded. The differences between these different plant functional types have been sort of, adjusted and so on. And so it's not transparent. Why do I think they'd be better? Because I did actually show one example with the CO2 seasonal cycle, but I mean, I have others in the pipeline. I know that there are some simple principles that actually do a much better job of predicting, basic features like this, CO2 in, out over large scales, do a much better job than any of the complex models we have. So that's the reason I'm confident, is because I've actually seen, the beginnings of this approach paying off.
So would you suggest it's more an issue of the data going into the models?
No, I think it's a question of how you design the models. You see, you have to remember as well that, that the models we have, I mean, they sort of grown and grown. And the core of every model, you'll find a description of the carbon and water exchanges. And we know that in possibly every case, probably every case of an existing complex sort of names model that's participating in the IPCC, we know those descriptions aren't obsolete. They're different from one another. They correspond to the state of knowledge around about 2000, maybe. And the state of knowledge has actually greatly improved.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Can I just ask you what your view is of the concept of tipping points?
I deliberately didn't mention. No, the thing is, tipping, I mean, you could say, a tipping point is a real thing. I mean, I talked briefly about the transition from the last ice age, and of course I did talk about the DO events, and, that there are these conditions under which it seems that a number of indicators in the Earth system can change quite abruptly, particularly when they're associated with sudden changes in the ocean circulation. This is a very special thing, very special instability in the Earth system. And so apparently they do exist, But I think that the concept has been, grossly overused. First of all, it's sort of implied that, if we change climate very much, well, we'll hit a tipping point. But, there's no actual evidence for that. There's no actual even, hypothesis for how such a thing would happen. It has been proposed that we might have a sudden cooling of some parts of the world. That was the basic, that was what lay behind the idea for the film The Day After Tomorrow, which was, of course, somewhat more exaggerated than hypothesis. But there was a hypothesis that some areas could actually experience a sudden cooling due to a shutdown of this ocean circulation. But it doesn't look like there's any evidence of that's really going to happen. I think some slowdown is on the cards, but not a rapid shutdown. But nevertheless, tipping points have been popularised through precisely this approach of expert opinion. So, there is a paper that consists entirely of the opinions of various experts, synthesised in various statistical ways and so on, but in the end, they're expert opinion. And there are many, actually, to be fair, the paper refers to tipping elements rather than tipping points, but it's sort of the same thing. And so there are a number of other examples used in there that I don't think really qualify for being tipping points in the sense of a sort of a global transition. They're more regional changes. And I think, changes in ecosystems, by their nature, are capable, ecosystems are capable of undergoing tipping points, no doubt at all. But, that's like the ecosystem in a place. It's not, a vast amount of carbon over a large area.
Thanks for an interesting talk. I like the limit you put on it at the beginning. I'll make a point and then ask a question. The point was about the needs of policymakers. Policymakers don't just think in terms of adaptation and mitigation. They also think in terms of the failure to adapt and the failure to mitigate. And that brings us round to the insurance companies' needs of understanding the risk involved. So you said at the beginning that you were going to focus on land use, on land and the impact on the carbon cycle. But the land that's actively, biologically active is maybe 10% of the planet, 90% is covered with water or ice. What's the level of uncertainty in those regions?
Actually, about a third of the planet is land, and almost all of that is covered with vegetation, whether dense or less dense. And in the ocean, I think there probably is a similar story. I mean, I'm not an ocean expert at all, but of course there are climate changes going on. There are impacts on species that that we can record, just as we're able to do on land. And there is also a great deal of uncertainty about the more detailed biological impacts. And of course, there is another, there's another sort of joker in the pack in the ocean, which is the effects of the direct effects of CO2 on the calcification process, which affects a lot of phytoplankton and affects corals, because the ocean is becoming more acid as a result of that CO2. And I think we really, at the moment, we just don't have a very good handle on how important that is.
Last question from
So could I just ask then, in your opinion, whether you think that there is more risk to the population and to our progress from the land or from the oceans?
Oh, goodness. Well, I put my money on the land because, we live here and it's where most of our food comes from. But, there's issues about fisheries and so on as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, at this stage, I think we should draw proceedings to a close. But doing that, I'd like to thank AXA for their support of science in general and of this chair in particular, and Jean Duf for coming here today. Now, if you want to learn more about what AXA does, there's a booklet that you can gather on the way out. There is also a Grantham Insitute discussion paper that Colin Prentice has written around the topic of today's lecture, so you can see exactly what he thinks in some more detail. And there's going to be a reception outside that you're invited to as well. But I'd like to finish by thanking Colin himself for this entertaining romp through the the carbon cycle and the terrestrial biosphere with various knocks at people on the way, and also setting himself up as a target to produce this simple version of what the terrestrial biosphere is doing in maybe 3 or 4 years, but certainly in the 6 years of his AXA chair. So I welcome you to all to return in 3 to 4 years or 6 years to hear whether he did it. Anyway, thank you very much, Colin.